So future plans and hopes. Go ahead, Lisa. For the cemetery itself, I want to make sure that the town of Cortlandville knows it's caring for it, and maybe there's a budget item put in place, and kind of codify and solidify that whole idea that they're caring for this cemetery. And I would like to plant in their minds the notion that they have 18 others somewhere in the town of Cortlandville that maybe they want to be paying attention to. I suspect they don't. I want to continue to do the kind of research here that I'm alluding to before. And again, if anybody's got any leads to follow up on, family leads, etc., please pass those on to me. And for me, this is where the marketing part comes in, Judy. For me, it's all about education and promotion. So this is where the advertising guy comes into it. I think that we need to do something to promote this cemetery, to raise all of the votes in Cortland County as it relates to the cemetery. I think more people need to know more about cemeteries so that they're cared for and preserved and documented. So I want to do a lot of that kind of stuff. And for me, that means public relations. It means talking like this, as painful as it may be for you guys. It means getting out there and making sure the community understands this resource and actually gets behind it and does something about it before they all disappear. So the question, and I know that people in here know the answer to this, so I'm going to look past those people and say, does anybody have any sense of how many abandoned graveyards like the one at South Cortland there might be in the town of, in the county of Cortland? Some people know. Try not to. Say again?
You said 18.
That's in the town of Cortlandville. So you got to include Cincinnati, you got to include Taylor, Marathon. 59. 59. Dr. Gus says. Dr. Gustafson says 59. Okay, there are actually, to the credit of Mary Dexter, who I'll talk about in a moment, there are at least 150 of them in our county. So she's done the research. She and folks from the Historical Society who have walked, they've visited all of these places. They've written them down. They know the locations. They've got a giant map that they can spread out on the table when you go and visit. And as far as digitization of them goes, on RootsWeb, we've got basically 55 of the 150, 37 of which have a basic listing of the headstone. So we're looking at a third of the documentation that we really should have for the cemeteries around this county, that at least as it relates on it being online. You know, you can't go on Google and find all of the 150 cemeteries documented in Cortland. By comparison, in Tompkins County, there are 184. Nearly all of them have very meticulous transcriptions, which means that, you know, the information on the stone is written down. There's a photograph of the stone, and generally 70% plus. They've done a hell of a job, because the community got together and did a hell of a job to document the cemeteries that they have in Tompkins County. So I'm not slamming anybody here. I just think we can do better, and it may be we just have to put some feet on the street, cameras in hands, and notepads in hands, and go out and document these things before they disappear, and they will disappear. So for me, I think organization. What do we need? Well, we need another 501c3. We need another nonprofit in the community, and that would be the Cortland County Cemetery Association. And a marketing guy immediately go for a logo. So we got a logo. By the way, that's obviously from one of the gravestones in the South Cortland Cemetery, and this is another one. So those are like graphic depictions, modern, of those carvings. And it would have a mission, like I've been describing: preserve, document, educate. I've already met with some historians last Friday, actually. So the status would be, you know, get a consensus. Do we really need another organization to do this job, or should it be hosted maybe at one of the organizations that we have already dedicated to history? And that's a question I'm floating in. I don't even know yet where this might go. But if we did, we would have to draft bylaws. We'd have to do all the things that not-for-profits do. They have board members. They recruit volunteers. They establish best practices for maintenance and signage. And they have future plans. So maybe you know, they collaborate to do more. Maybe we develop a walking brochure or a map that you could walk around with and visit some of these sites. And maybe you go out into the schools and engage school children and people up at the college to turn this into a topic of interest and really leverage the asset in addition to the other historical assets that we already have leveraged. And again, marketing guy. I immediately think, oh, okay, so we got to do something online. So we got one page dedicated to a website dedicated to the South Cortland Cemetery, and we need 150 more. Maybe that's overkill. Maybe there's a simpler way to go about this, but that's kind of how I think, and it's a big task, but I think it needs to be done. self-guided tour, right now it's blank. I didn't do that on purpose, but the reality is it's blank. We don't have a self-guided tour of all these cemeteries, and we haven't documented them to do that. And for me, I'd like to go to the next step, and so when you visit the South Cortland Cemetery, there's a sign that says some of the information about that cemetery, but then there are some basic rules. You know, this is what you shouldn't do in a cemetery. Don't do grave rubbings. Don't touch them. Don't whack them with a weed whacker. Don't do this, don't do that, so people understand how sensitive they are. But then you could have other kind of informational, interpretive type signs. So it could talk about symbology on the gravestones. It could talk about, well, geez, there's so many aspects to cemeteries. So some of the signs could be about some of those aspects. So you pop in there and you'll learn a thing or two. It's not just this obscure place you drive by every day. I made it. I know I go fast and I ramble. So 5 minutes for questions? A couple minutes for questions?
I just want to say one thing. Can you just talk about when we went to look for the one headstone 2 weeks ago that we couldn't find because it was probably...
Captain John Cole.
Can you just talk about that? I mean, that's how timely this is.
Yeah. The thing about gravestones is, you know, not only do the faces shear off, but people will walk off with them. They'll fall, and then ground will do, because it's liquid, as I mentioned before, it'll start to like move on top of the stones and move on top of the stones, and you have to actually prod to find them. So there's a gentleman, his wives, he's got 2 wives, they're buried there, Elizabeth, and I forget his other wife's name, but we can't find John Cole's gravestone.
You could find them. You could find them.
Yeah. So, you know, they're in danger. Any other questions? Go ahead, Doug.
Is there a tradition of burying in these cemeteries in east-west direction?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is.
Explain that.
Yeah, I'm not sure how meticulously it was practiced, but essentially, the practice was you would orient your body and the headstone towards the east, so that when the sun comes up, the sun hits the gravestone, and basically, well, the gravestone in particular, so that there's an awakening aspect to it, as opposed to the sun setting kind of aspect to it, which is this, you know, they don't see. It's a symbolic thing. It goes back to the willows and evergreens and the symbology on the stones themselves. If you can emphasize that death and being buried and going to heaven is a beginning, and use the rising sun to essentially emphasize that point. They were conscious of it, and they made that conscious decision, and a lot of gravestones are basically oriented exactly that way. So yes.
Can people still be buried in these old cemeteries or no?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure anybody asks.
There are empty spaces.
Yes. I'd have to look a little bit more closely at the law. I think they have to be active in the sense that somebody's actively managing them and has a board of directors and all of that kind of stuff. So I don't think these cemeteries have that infrastructure around them, so I don't think they can take in new interments. Interestingly, I think an organization can buy them, take them from the town if there's an organization in place and kind of reconstitute them, I believe. But that's probably a pretty ornery process.
How many of these 150 cemeteries are family cemeteries?
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect a heck of a lot of them. And you had mentioned sometimes when you're grouse hunting, you stumble upon them. They're in the middle of farm fields, and they're not necessarily accessible from a road. So I imagine a very big portion of them are family cemeteries. But I know that's a subset of the 150. It's not in addition to. And I mean, those kinds of distinctions, hopefully if we document these things, I'm hopefully not going to do 150 myself, but those distinctions need to be made, obviously.
If you have 150, how did you get that 150? Where did the number come from?
Mary Dexter, she did a lot of the research I've done, probably a heck of a lot more than I've done. And she literally went with folks of her acquaintance, some of them at the Historical Society, and visited them. So they've got a book there. It's like a light blue book, and you flip through. And she's got the town of Taylor, and she's got little points indicated, but not the names within the cemeteries, just the cemeteries themselves, generally speaking. So she documented them on a big map, and the map exists, but it's in hard copy, and you have to go to the society to see it.
I was going to ask you a question.
Last question.
When I was in Girl Scouts in Tompkins County, I went to Girl Scout camp, which is on the
Yes, and my thinking is South Portland was exactly that, because there were two churches, but there was no affiliation between that cemetery and those churches. The churches have come and gone, the pastors have come and gone, and they're gone. But the cemetery was essentially that. It was a community cemetery. If you lived in the area, you could put your people in there, I guess, if you paid some sort of fee. So.
The ones associated with churches were called churchyards. I think the old phrase churchyard actually meant a cemetery.
Sure.
Like in Houma, the Congregational Church had a cemetery. They
You
moved
bet.
it to Glen, up to Glen.
You bet. So that's it. It's a slice, but it's a start.